Dear friends, welcome to another episode here in the world of military and geopolitical analysis. In this video, we will be talking about the decision made by the United States government to classify Brazil's two most powerful criminal factions, the Comando Vermelho and the Primeiro Comando da Capital, as terrorist organizations, and what this designation will mean in practice from now on, both for Brazil and for a wider region. On Thursday, May 28th, the United States Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, took a decision that struck directly at the heart of Brazil. Washington now treats the Red Command and the First Capital Command as terrorist organizations, a formal legal classification carrying heavy practical consequences inside and outside American territory. But what exactly was decided by Rubio, and why should this matter to every single person watching this video tonight? Because behind this seemingly bureaucratic announcement lies a doctrine, a strategy, and possibly the first brick in a legal wall that Washington has built before, with consequences that ended in military action. To understand whether Brazil could now become a target, we must first understand the machinery that has just been switched on. There are two categories at play in Rubio's announcement, and understanding the distinction between them is essential to grasp what is truly happening here. The first category took effect immediately, on Thursday itself, with the CV and the PCC designated as SDGT, which stands for Specially Designated Global Terrorists. This classification rests on an executive order, number 13,224, and on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known by the acronym IEEPA. In practice, this is a financial weapon blocking any asset the groups may hold under American jurisdiction and allowing Washington to punish anyone maintaining a financial link with them. The second category is far harsher, with Rubio announcing his intention to designate both factions as FTO, Foreign Terrorist Organizations, taking effect from June 5th. The legal foundation here is Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which creates criminal liability for anyone offering material support to these groups, whether financing, resources, or cooperation, forming a wider and far more aggressive net. In short, the United States has surrounded these two groups from both the financial side and the criminal side simultaneously. The official justification offered by the United States for taking this step is straightforward, at least on paper. For Washington, the CV and the PCC are two of the most violent criminal organizations operating inside Brazil today, and here lies the central point of the American argument. These organizations operate illicit networks that do not stop at the Brazilian border. They spread across the entire region, reaching all the way into the United States itself, feeding the trafficking pipelines that supply the vast American consumer market with narcotics, weapons, and laundered capital. But this decision fits into a far larger pattern within the Trump administration, the so-called war against the cartel. In recent months, the United States had already applied the same terrorist label to the Tren de Aragua and to the Cartel de los Soles in Venezuela, to the factions known as Los Lobos and Los Choneros in Ecuador, and to the Mexican cartels of Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación. You, with Brazil now formally entering the same regional list. What we are witnessing, therefore, is not an isolated act against Brazil, but rather the latest chapter in a hemispheric doctrine being methodically constructed by Washington. And then there is the political layer of this story, which cannot be ignored by anyone trying to read between the lines. The classification of these groups as terrorist organizations came out just after the visit of Senator and presidential pre-candidate Flavio Bolsonaro to Donald Trump in Washington. Lula, who had also recently been to the White House, had already declared on several occasions that he does not support classifying the CV and the PCC as international terrorist organizations. And the timing of Rubio's announcement was therefore read by many analysts as something more than a coincidence. But what does this classification actually change in practice for those living far from Washington's corridors of power? The most immediate effect is financial and not military, with the designation isolating economically anyone who maintains any kind of link with these factions. Assets under American jurisdiction are frozen instantly. People, shell companies, operators, and intermediaries connected to the CV and the PCC enter the crosshairs of a sanctions machine that rarely misses its target. And there is an important chain effect, because banks across the entire world tend to flee from any operation that touches these organizations, fearing American retaliation. For Brazil, this brings a very real and immediate risk, because if connections are found between these factions and the Brazilian financial system, companies and institutions inside Brazil could be dragged into these sanctions, whether they realize the exposure existed or not. But the practical target in the short term will mostly be the money laundering structures, the shell networks, and the front businesses that allow billions of dollars in drug proceeds to circulate quietly through legitimate economies. That is where Washington's blade falls first, and that is where the pain will be felt first. Now, and this point is absolutely fundamental for the rest of our analysis tonight. The classification on its own does not grant the United States legal authority to use military force inside Brazil. The terrorist label is a sanctions tool, not an automatic war authorization. And this leads us directly to the second and far more disturbing question that everyone is asking. Is an attack on Brazilian soil actually possible? To answer that question with any honesty, we must first understand that the Trump government has built a very specific legal staircase before step by careful step against Venezuela. First, Washington designated the Venezuelan groups as terrorists, exactly as it has just done with the CV and the PCC. Then it notified the United States Congress that the country was officially in a non-international armed conflict against these cartels, a phrase that may sound technical but carries enormous legal weight. From that moment on, Washington began treating the members of those organizations as unlawful combatants under the framework of the laws of war. And only then, with this entire legal framework carefully assembled brick by brick, did the actual military action begin to unfold. What followed was dozens of strikes against vessels suspected of trafficking in the Caribbean Sea, with nearly 200 people killed in the operation. And the culminating point, the moment that shocked the entire continent, was the capture of dictator Nicolas Maduro in January of 2026, accused of being one of the leaders of one of these organizations recently classified as terrorist. In other words, the designation of the CV and the PCC is the exact same legal brick that was used against Venezuela. And that is precisely why the alarm bells are ringing so loudly inside Brazil tonight. But is absolutely crucial for understanding what comes next. The differences between Venezuela and Brazil change the entire calculation in ways that cannot be overstated. Venezuela was treated by Washington as a hostile regime, an illegitimate government, a narco state whose leader the United States did not even formally recognize as president. The diplomatic relationship had been broken for years. Sanctions had been piling up for over a decade, and the international community itself was deeply divided over Maduro's legitimacy. Brazil is a completely different reality. And this distinction must be made clear before anyone draws hasty conclusions. The country is widely recognized by the United States as the largest democracy in Latin America, the largest country in the entire region, a sovereign and functional state with real armed forces and full diplomatic relations with Washington. For these reasons, an attack inside Brazilian territory carried out without the consent of Brasilia would not be an operation against a failed narco state, which was essentially what happened in the Venezuelan case. It would be something entirely different. It would be an act of aggression against a sovereign state, a direct violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter itself. But there is an intermediate possibility that deserves careful attention from everyone watching tonight, because it represents the most realistic scenario going forward. When the United States designated the Ecuadorian factions as terrorist organizations, Rubio himself was explicit in stating that the measure opened space for sharing intelligence that could be used in lethal operations conducted jointly with the local government. This is the model that should worry analysts the most, because it does not require formal invasion, nor does it require breaking diplomatic ties, nor does it require congressional authorization for war. But joint actions depend on a host government willing to collaborate, and that is precisely where the Brazilian case becomes complicated. The Lula government is not that kind of partner, not even close. The United States has a long history of carrying out attacks against structures and individuals linked to groups designated as terrorists on foreign territory, even without the explicit consent of local governments. But, and I must repeat this point, the Brazilian case is genuinely different. Even with Lula refusing to classify the PCC and the CVS terrorist groups, Brazil is not under any international definition a failed narco state like Venezuela was considered to be. Brazil is not hostile to the United States, and it is not, at least officially, fully complicit with these criminal groups. And this brings us to the question that genuinely bothers many people watching tonight. Given all the terror that these factions spread across Brazilian cities every single day, why does Brazil itself not classify them as terrorist organizations within its own legal system? The answer lies inside the Brazilian anti-terrorism law number 13,260 of 2016, which carries a very narrow and very specific definition. For an act to be considered terrorism inside Brazil, it must have a specific motivation tied to xenophobia, or to prejudice based on race, color, ethnicity, or religion, or to a clearly political and ideological objective. Therefore, according to the current Lula government interpretation, killing civilians, kidnapping families, exploding cars, shutting down entire avenues, and holding whole neighborhoods and cities hostage somehow does not qualify as terrorism, because according to the official Brazilian position, these groups are simply pursuing profit. A position that strikes many ordinary Brazilians as legally absurd, especially those living daily under the shadow of these factions. In summary, the United States has transformed the CV and the PCC in practice into targets of a powerful sanctions machine. And the immediate effect of this transformation is financial, not military. But the fear of an American attack on Brazilian soil has real foundation, because this was exactly the path Washington followed against Venezuela, step by careful step, until the final military action arrived. However, as I said before, Brazil is profoundly different from Venezuela in almost every relevant dimension. And not even in Mexico, a country far more surrendered to organized crime and sitting right next to the United States, did the Trump administration carry out strikes without coordination with the Mexican government, with Washington limiting itself to providing intelligence data for the recent actions involving the capture or elimination of powerful faction leaders. Therefore, at least in principle, the measures just announced by the United States will have a far greater effect on the financial network feeding these groups than on Brazilian soil itself. But of course, the door remains half open for more direct and forceful military actions. And if you enjoyed this video, do not forget to leave your like here. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you do not miss any update.